Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that's super important for writers of all levels, and that is how to structure a book.
Structure is definitely one of those things that a lot of writers maybe don't think about right away.
Right, exactly. They get so caught up in the excitement of like coming up with a new idea that they forget about actually planning it out.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, luckily we've got some great insights from the folks over at Malala Media Publications to help us break down this whole structuring thing.
They really do offer a lot of great frameworks for thinking about structure.
Yeah. So maybe first we could just kind of step back and talk about why structure is so important in the first place. Like, why is it more than just, making sure your chapters are in the right order?
Well, think about it this way. Have you ever started reading a book and just felt completely lost, like you were wandering around in a maze?
Oh gosh, all the time. Especially with some of those like really complex sci-fi novels where the timeline jumps all over the place.
Exactly. And that's often a sign of poor structure.
Hmm.
A well-structured book, on the other hand, it acts as a guide. It leads the reader through the story or the information and makes it both engaging and impactful.
Okay, so it's like the structure is kind of a secret code that unlocks the book's full potential.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Gotcha. So whether you're writing like a thriller, a romance, or even a self-help book, you need that solid structure to make it work.
Absolutely.
So then how do we actually approach structuring for different genres? I mean, like, I get that a fantasy epic is going to need a different structure than, say, a guide to personal finance.
Right. And that's where Malala Media Publications comes in. They offer some really helpful insights. So, like for fiction, one of the classic approaches is the three-act structure.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. You set the scene in Act 1, build the conflict in Act 2, and then reach the resolution in Act 3.
So it's kind of like a roller coaster ride.
Exactly. A slow climb, a
Yeah.
thrilling drop, and then that feeling of like exhilaration as it comes to a stop.
Love that analogy. But I've also heard writers talk about things like the Save the Cat beat sheet. Is that something totally different?
Not entirely. Save the Cat is just a more detailed breakdown of story beats focusing on 15 key points to keep readers engaged.
15 key points.
Yeah,
That's pretty specific.
it is. But it can be a really useful tool for plotting out your story.
Okay. So are you saying that like every successful novel has to follow these frameworks? Like, what about those books that break the mold and still manage to totally captivate readers?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are definitely books out there that break the mold. But even when they do, there's usually some kind of underlying structure at play, even if it's not super obvious.
So it's like jazz music. You have the basic chords and scales, but then the real magic comes from improvisation.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. And what about nonfiction? Like, how do we approach structure when we're dealing with, facts and information instead of like fictional narratives?
Well, in nonfiction, the focus shifts from creating a narrative arc to building a logical and engaging presentation of information.
Right. So instead of like plot twists and cliffhangers, we're thinking about organizing chapters and presenting evidence.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some of the key strategies for structuring nonfiction?
Well, Malala Media Publications highlights a few different approaches. One effective technique is to structure your book around your core message.
Okay, so like having that one central idea that everything else revolves around.
Right. Like in Atomic Habits by James Clear, the whole book is built around the idea of building small, sustainable habits.
Oh yeah, Atomic Habits is a great example. Now that you mention it, I can totally see how that central message acts as a kind of anchor for the whole book.
Exactly. Another effective technique is to structure your chapters around reader questions or problems. Think about Tim Ferriss's The 4-Hour Workweek.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Each chapter tackles a specific challenge related to like productivity or escaping the 9 to 5 grind.
Right. So you're essentially offering solutions to the reader's pain points, which automatically makes the information more engaging and relevant.
Makes total sense. So whether we're writing fiction or nonfiction, we need to keep our readers in mind.
Always.
So I have a confession to make. Um, when I think about nonfiction, I sometimes worry about it becoming like dry or textbooky.
Ah, yeah, I get that.
Is there a way to like bring in elements of storytelling to make it more captivating, even when we're dealing with like facts and figures?
Absolutely. In fact, storytelling is just as important in nonfiction as it is in fiction, maybe even more so. It's all about finding ways to make the information come alive, to make it resonate with readers on an emotional level.
Wait, storytelling in nonfiction. This I got to hear more about.
It's all about using those narrative techniques we love in fiction to make information more engaging.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. Like, what kind of techniques are we talking about here?
Well, one powerful technique is to start each chapter with a hook.
A hook. Like a compelling anecdote or a surprising statistic.
Exactly. Think about Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. He opens the book with the story of Roseto, this Italian-American town where people lived unusually long lives.
Right. And immediately you're like, wait, what's going on here? I need to know more.
Exactly. And it's not just about starting with a story. You can weave narratives throughout your nonfiction book to illustrate concepts, make complex ideas more relatable, even create emotional connections with your readers.
Hmm. So it's like we're using stories as little bridges to help readers get from one concept to the next.
Exactly. Now, I actually want to pause here for a second and get our listeners involved.
Ooh, I love when we get interactive. What you got in mind?
We've been talking about books that hook you from the start, right?
Mhm.
So I'm curious to hear from our listeners, what are some books that really grabbed your attention right away?
Yeah, what were those opening lines or those stories or those statistics that just made you want to keep reading? Head down to the comment section and tell us all about it. We want to know what books hooked you and what techniques the authors used to pull you in.
We'll definitely be checking out your responses and maybe even share some of our favorites in the next episode.
Absolutely. So listeners, don't be shy. Tell us what's got you hooked. And now let's get back to our conversation about storytelling in nonfiction.
So another really effective way to bring storytelling into nonfiction is by using real-life examples.
Oh, yeah, like using stories about actual people to illustrate a point.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Think about Brene Brown's work on vulnerability. She could have just presented the research and the theories, but she doesn't. She brings it to life with personal stories and anecdotes.
right. Which makes it so much more relatable.
Exactly. And it's not just about making it relatable, it's about creating emotional connections. When readers feel something, whether it's empathy or inspiration, they're way more likely to remember the information and actually act on it.
So it's like we're not just giving them information, we're giving them an experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about starting with a hook and using real-life examples. What are some other storytelling strategies we can use in our nonfiction?
Well, one that Malala Media Publications really emphasizes is the power of ending chapters and even the entire book with a story.
Hmm, but how do we do that without just repeating what we've already said?
Well, think of it as showcasing the so what of your information.
Okay, so like not just summarizing the key points, but showing how those points can actually be applied in the real world.
Exactly. It could be a case study of someone who used the advice you're giving, or even just a hypothetical scenario that shows the potential outcomes.
So it's like taking the reader on a journey from understanding to application.
Precisely.
Love it.
Ah.
Oh, hey, speaking of those books that hook you from the start, we're starting to get some great responses from our listeners.
Oh, yeah. What are they saying?
Well, a lot of them are talking about authors using vivid imagery and sensory details to draw them in.
Yeah, like they're painting a picture with words.
Exactly. And it totally works. It reminds me of that quote by Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
That's so true. We're also seeing a lot of examples of authors using suspense and intrigue to hook readers.
Even in nonfiction.
Yeah, like posing thought-provoking questions or hinting at surprising revelations.
Oh, wow. So it's like even though we're dealing with facts and information, we can still tap into those elements of storytelling that make readers want to keep turning the pages.
Absolutely. Now, storytelling is essential, but we can't forget about the practical side of structuring a book.
Right, because even with the best stories, we still need a solid framework to hold it all together.
Exactly. And that's where the practical steps from Malala Media Publications come in. They offer some really great tools and techniques for organizing your thoughts and mapping out your book.
Yeah, I've got to admit, this is where I sometimes feel like I'm fumbling in the dark. Like I've got all these ideas swirling around in my head,
Yeah.
but I don't know how to actually turn them into a structured outline.
Well, one of the methods they recommend is mind mapping.
Mind mapping. I've heard of that, but I've never actually tried it. How does it work?
Basically, it's a visual brainstorming technique that helps you see the big picture of your book.
Okay, so it's like creating a roadmap for your book.
Exactly. You start with your central theme or core message in the middle of the page, and then branch out from there with key ideas and subtopics.
I can see how that would be super helpful for getting all your thoughts down on paper.
Yeah, and it's also really flexible. You can add, delete, rearrange things as your ideas evolve.
Awesome. So once you have your mind map, what's next?
Well, Malala Media Publications suggests taking it a step further with storyboarding.
Storyboarding. Is that like what filmmakers do?
It's similar but adapted for writers. You basically lay out each chapter or section of your book visually to see how they flow together.
Oh, that's cool. So it's like taking your mind map and turning it into an even more detailed blueprint.
Exactly. And one tip they give is to use different colored index cards or sticky notes to represent different elements.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, like you could use blue for character development, yellow for plot points, green for research findings.
I love that. It would make it so much easier to see how everything's fitting together.
Right. And don't be afraid to experiment and play around with different structures until you find one that feels right for your book.
Okay, so it's not about finding the perfect structure, but the structure that best serves our story or the information we're trying to share.
Exactly. And this is where I want to turn back to our listeners for a minute.
Ooh, wow.
We've been talking about mind mapping and storyboarding, but I'm curious, what other techniques have you found helpful for outlining?
Yeah. Have you tried using software? Do you prefer pen and paper? What are your go-to strategies for outlining a book? Share your tips and tricks in the comments below,
We'll be highlighting some of your insights in our next episode.
for sure. So listeners, let us know your outlining secrets. And now let's get back to those practical steps from Molalla Media Publications. We've talked about mind mapping and storyboarding. What else do they recommend?
Well, one of their most emphasized points is the importance of getting feedback.
Feedback.
Yeah.
So like sharing our work with beta readers or critique partners.
Exactly. It can be tempting to keep our writing to ourselves, especially in the early stages.
Oh, I know that feeling.
But Malala Media Publications really stresses that getting feedback early and often is one of the best ways to strengthen our structure and make sure our book is connecting with readers.
Okay, I can see how that would be valuable.
Yeah.
But sometimes feedback can be tough to take, you know, especially when we're feeling vulnerable about our work. Any tips for navigating that process?
Yeah, absolutely. First, be selective about who you ask for feedback. Choose readers who you trust to be honest, but also constructive.
Good point.
And when you do get feedback, remember, it's just one person's perspective. You don't have to take every suggestion, but it's important to consider each one carefully.
Okay, so like take it all in, but then make your own decisions about what to implement.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to revise and refine your structure based on the feedback you receive.
Right.
In fact, Malala Media Publications encourages writers to think of revision as a core part of the writing process, not just something you do at the end.
So it's about embracing that process of learning and growing and making our structure even stronger with each draft.
Exactly. And here's a final thought from Malala Media Publications that I find really insightful. A strong structure is not a cage that confines your creativity. It's a scaffolding that supports it.
Ooh, I like that. It's like saying that structure isn't about limiting our ideas, but about giving them a solid foundation to grow on.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm loving this conversation. And actually, before we wrap up our deep dive into the art of structuring a book, I want to circle back to something we were talking about earlier. We were talking about how fiction and nonfiction need kind of different approaches to structuring, but you also mentioned that there are common threads that run through both genres.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are some of those like shared principles that every writer should keep in mind when it comes to structure?
Well, one of the most important ones, and this is something that Malala Media Publications emphasizes too, is pacing.
Pacing.
Yeah, like how you control the flow of information and emotion in your book.
Okay, so it's not just about what we include, but also about when and how we reveal it to the reader.
Exactly, and that's where techniques like foreshadowing and cliffhangers come in, and even things like chapter breaks.
Right, because a well-placed chapter break can be like a mini cliffhanger.
For sure.
Okay, so pacing is definitely something I've struggled with in my own writing. Like, I tend to either rush through important scenes or get bogged down in details.
Yeah, I think a lot of writers struggle with that.
Any tips for finding that sweet spot?
Well, one helpful tip from Malala Media Publications is to think of your book as a series of peaks and valleys.
Peaks and valleys.
Yeah, like you want to have moments of high tension and excitement, followed by moments of reflection or slower paced exposition.
So it's all about creating that variation that keeps readers engaged.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Okay, so another shared principle that Malala Media Publications talks about is clarity.
Oh, yeah, clarity is super important.
So we're talking about writing in a way that's easy to understand even when we're dealing with complex ideas.
Exactly. And this applies to both fiction and nonfiction.
Right? Like in fiction, we need to create a world that makes sense to the reader, even if it's like a fantastical world.
Right. And in nonfiction, we need to make sure the information is presented in a clear and concise way.
Okay, so even if we have the best ideas in the world, It doesn't matter if we can't communicate those ideas effectively to the reader. And
Exactly.
that's where things like transitions and word choice and even visuals can really help.
Right.
It's funny, we often talk about show, don't tell
Yeah.
in fiction, but I think that principle applies to nonfiction too.
Oh, totally.
Instead of just stating facts, we need to find ways to bring those facts to life.
Exactly.
And that's where the art of storytelling really comes full circle.
It all comes back to storytelling.
This has been such a great deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about the power of structure.
Me too.
And before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought from Malala Media Publications.
Okay.
They say that the best structure is the one that disappears.
That's an interesting one.
What do you think they mean by that?
Well, I think they mean that a truly effective structure should work so seamlessly that the reader doesn't even notice it.
Right. It just flows naturally.
Exactly. It's like a well-built house. You don't see the foundation or the framing, but you feel the solidity and the flow.
Perfect analogy. So the structure is like the silent partner that makes everything work.
Exactly.
Well, that's a great goal for all of us writers to strive for.
I think so too.
Well, that's it for this deep dive into the art of structuring a book.
Thanks for having me.
It was great chatting with you. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us. We'll see you in the next episode.
Happy writing.